So thank you, everybody who's joining us online today. We are in a room of about 70 people at the Monash City campus in Collins Street in Melbourne. We've had a fabulous, really productive day. Had some good food at lunch as well, if making you all jealous. Hopefully you've had some nice lunch. It's been a really robust and great conversation and also brilliant networking. And Fredric is going to share some of those learnings with you all today. But first I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are today here in Melbourne, but also the lands of the everybody around Australia. And if people who have attended our webinars before, if you'd like to put into the chat the country that you are on, that would be fabulous. We will be closed captioning this webinar, so people can access those closed captions by clicking on the CC button at the top or bottom of their screen. If you have any issues in the back end, you can email us at adcet.admin.adcet.edu.au. If I've done that wrong, Jane will put that into the chat. Fredric's going to speak for around 40-45 minutes, and then we will go to questions. We'll have questions from the room, and we'll also have questions in the chat online. If you want to ask Fredric some questions, please put that in the Q&A, not the chat, just so that we'll be able to grab that from there. The presentation today is being recorded and it is going to be made available on the ADCET website. I think that's all. So I wish you could all see everybody here. We might at the end, if we get a chance, turn the computer around and we'll all say goodbye to you all at the end of the day. But we currently have 70 people online, and 70 people in the room. So I think we've done pretty well. So thank you, and now I'll hand over to Fredric.
Thank you. So welcome to all of folks joining us online. So I'm just going to move my computer here. I'm also going to do a land acknowledgement. Okay, this is stuck again. Oh, there we go. A land acknowledgement of my own. So I just want to say that I'm honored to live and work on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Silex people, otherwise known as the Okanagan Valley, which you see on screen at the moment. It's a valley in the middle of British Columbia. I also want to say that I have the pleasure of working on unceded and ancestral territory of the Ticambas people, and I also acknowledge the Aboriginal custodians of this land I'm here on today, and the elders and their claims to land as well. So welcome to this session if you're joining us online, and if you're in the room, we're going to continue with the reflection that we've had. I had the difficult task of creating the sort of hybrid recipe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick recap of what we've discussed today, which will be useful for the folks online. It will also enable people in the room to think about action plan and what piece of that reflection you want to take into 2023 as you start looking at your blueprint for the work that you're doing in UDL, or maybe to develop that work further. I've got a whole bunch of posted questions already, which will get me going at the end of that recap, and I will take questions both from the chat and from the room as well as we continue. So the starting point today, and I'm just going to repeat that, but the folks in the room have heard it this morning, was that really we had a crunch really in the historical development of UDL, in the sense that we've had in North America certainly about 20 years now of sporadic communities of practice, individual faculty and individual services developing a lot of great UDL initiatives. But what we're not seeing is a sort of scaling up and across campus sort of implementations that manage to really capture that systemic sort of growth and to really manage to embed themselves right across services. As we've talked about today, we can certainly see all the stakeholders and we can certainly see all the areas of needs, but creating the matrix and managing to grow that into an action plan for whole campus is a challenge still to come for most of us. And I think that's, I can talk and say globally, around the world, we haven't seen any institution that has managed to get to that new frontier yet. So this is what we're here today to really think about for the Australian context, what it might look like if we want to carry that agenda forward. So we've had a lot of literature on why is this beneficial for diverse learners, how best to do this in the classroom, but we've been missing that literature and that scholarship too about how to grow this from a purely organizational and strategic sort of dimension, which is a very different dimension, and the arguments are going to be different, etc. And that's what we focused on today. We looked at 3 different areas. First of all, I'm going to go through them in turns, and each of them contains some threads. So for folks in the room, it's a recap and try and think about what you want to really focus on and take with you. And for the people online, it's an introduction to all of the rich discussions we've had today. So the first angle of reflection today was the approach is everything. And this notion of, first of all, we have to reflect about how we present this to the stakeholders. So thread 1 was, how does one begin and how do we brand this with our UDL colleagues? First of all, we've seen, and we've got a board up there that has about a good dozen stakeholders, from students to librarian, instructional designers, senior management, HR, legal, all of these stakeholders that we have to involve. But we have to think carefully about how to put that and present that information, put that information forward. And we discussed 2 models today, either presenting as something entirely new and getting that novelty aspect, or then saying, you know, this is something you've already done, you're already on that spectrum of development on UDL. We just need to see you moving a little bit further and to continue the work that you're doing. We've seen that really there is no one size fits all. There's not one solution that works for better than the others, but that all campuses are going to have a close look at their history, their culture, their size, and what works best for them. And that's a current theme today has been this notion of ecological blue mapping, that really we need to look at the canvas of a campus from an ecological perspective to see what suits its needs best. And this is what's going to give you a clue on the first 2 choices that we have out of the box, or something that we're used to and that we're just developing further. The second was the notion of leverage, and this notion that really amongst all these stakeholders, we also had a rising number of needs, and we identified 6 that I talked about today. In terms of pressing needs, why the landscape is changing and why we need something new, something that's actually going to meet the needs of this landscape, which is otherwise cracking. I think we can agree today, and we've talked about several times, that the old model of accessibility through accommodations is really cracking at the seams. We need something new. We need something that actually can deal with the demographics, with the need for social model practices, and that really embeds itself well with EDI and with a wider look at diversity on campuses. So finding the leverage again is going to be essential that we do from an ecological perspective, because not every campus is going to be able to focus on all the stakeholders and on all the needs that exist. So choosing adequately and wisely the main stakeholders you want to prioritize and the needs that you are going to acknowledge and work with is going to be very important. Thread number 2 is recognizing and acknowledging these needs. And that's this meant today in our discussion saying to take the time for people to acknowledge the fact that they need something new, that they need a new approach, whether it's faculty and they're telling you that they need more sustainable teaching practices, whether it's accessibility folks that are telling you the old system doesn't work, we need to move towards something else. But you give time and pockets of opportunities for people to actually acknowledge and form, and verbalize the fact that the old way no longer works and it's time to move to something else. And it may seem like something symbolic, but giving people the opportunity for that time to acknowledge the frustrations that they have is going to be really important in them giving you buy-in into something that you present to them, in this instance, UDL. The last thread in this sort of a segment of the talk was to look at the opportune moment that is represented by the end of the COVID landscape. And we had an overwhelming majority of participants in the room who thought that the COVID crisis overall had been beneficial to the work that we do with UDL and UDL implementation. I tend to agree with that, although there have been sporadic areas of tension. Overall, it's created an opportune landscape for us to really embrace this. Particularly, again, just to remind you, the main finding in my research is that for the first time ever in history, most educators across sectors are saying that they're finally embracing the role of designer and that they understand the impact of that design. So for us, in terms of UDL advocacy, it's phenomenal. It's really going to be some rich grounds there, fertile grounds for us to grant some action as we go into 2023. So questions I have for you as we finish that section. These are key factors of success, but they are currently an afterthought for many of UDL advocates. So how do we change mind shifts, right? How do we not have these factors become afterthoughts, but to have them early on in our development plans, and particularly how do we put on the brakes, right? Everyone in this room is you know, excited and wants to move this forward, but a lot of what I've talked about today, particularly in the first part, is actually about putting on the brakes and going back to the blueprint and thinking strategically before we actually do it. So that's my question for you all, is how are we going to, you know, slow down our enthusiasm and actually plan before we jump into action? Because that's been the pitfall in the last 10 years, is people have been too excited and too willing to jump in into the fire, but then it's been really difficult after the fact to try and do that strategic piece. It needs to be done before you really jump in. So a question for you online and for you in the room as well. Section 2 was, I've entitled it, it's a messy job, but someone's got to do it, right? We've reflected on the ecology. Who should be driving this movement? Who should be involved? Who should be at the center of the drive for development? And there were five threads here. So the first one was being aware of institutional and strategic tension. We talked about a lot of points of tension between teaching and learning and accessibility services, between accessibility services and faculty. We talked about the lack of collaboration and communication between structural design and accessibility folks and faculty. Lots to work on, right, from people in the room. I hope on your to-do list, there's a lot of question marks and thought for the future, collaborations to work on, to focus on, to develop further, new collaborations to develop, etc. We also talked about creating multidisciplinary approaches to UDL implementation. And by this here, I meant that so far, we really focused UDL on disability and impairment. And there's really a need to really look at it in a wider way and look at diversity in terms of also including people who support culturally diverse students, international students, second language learner, lifelong learners, the full range of diverse learners which are on our campuses. At the moment, as we've explained, we're very siloed, we're very fragmented. We don't have many natural organic collaborations or avenues for communication with these people. So how do we bring them in? So how do we bring them in? How do we create these multidisciplinary approaches? It's very easy these days, right, to talk about multidisciplinary approaches. There's a lot of work that goes into that word. So as we leave today and we wrap up today, think about all the investment in time and efforts that this is going to take before we become truly multidisciplinary in the way we approach this. We talked about being conceptually consistent, and we talked about a lot of contradictions that exist in. We have a desire to scale up our UDL efforts, but as we try to scale them up, often we reveal some of the conceptual contradictions that are present in our own path. We talked about accessibility services, so often being stuck in medical model, in deficit model procedures. We could talk more generally about a lot of stuff that we do on campuses being bureaucratic and being quite opposed to what we're talking about in terms of UDL and in terms of these sort of free-flowing accessibility sort of processes. So a lot of reflection that we have to do there. There's a whole board over there that you can't see, but it talks about, you know, UDL in research, UDL in graduate work, UDL with employees, all of these points of friction that we need to solve before people take us seriously. It's a question of credibility. If we won't achieve the credibility unless we have a hard look at ourselves and we solve some of the tensions and some of the contradictions that exist in our discourse and our positioning. We also talked about supporting campus stakeholders as they transition into a new mindset. Not easy, because a lot of what is involved at the moment is moving people between two different ways of doing things. As I talked today, I talked about sitting between two chairs. It's really uncomfortable to sit between two chairs. It's very hard to supervise and support staff who are maybe feeling really threatened by the fact that, you know, they are doing things an old way and you ask them to do things a new way. And this involved a complete rethink about their self-perception of themselves in that job. So it could be accessibility folks supporting faculty instead of supporting students. It could be people who are still having to meet the normal need for accommodation through regular funding models, but they have to start thinking about working with faculty on doing things in a totally different way. Sometimes with no funding or sometimes with a different envelope funding. So transitioning people into this new mindset is not easy, and that requires a lot of forward-thinking, proactive reflection on all of us. The last thread was involving students. And I think, again, today we talked about how easy that seems on paper, but how difficult it can be. Students have, in the greatest part, been left out of the equation altogether. Sorry, I apologize. Very recently, I was asked to adjudicate on the UDL John Kelly Awards in Ireland, and the institutional awards have a component specifically that asks us to look at the ease with which these institutions have been able to communicate their UDL policy to students. And I would say, and I'm sure the organizers would agree with me, that I was definitely the weakest rating for all of the organizations, right? Very good at doing the research piece, very good at doing the strategic piece now, very good at communicating with the rest of the world, the results and the findings of what they were doing. But the student piece wasn't always super developed. It was emerging, it was there, but not yet systemic and endemic in the way we function. So have a hard think of that today. I think it's a big takeaway from today. How do we involve students in an authentic way? Whether it's working groups. I talked today about the necessity for having probably workshops and trainings and professional development for students themselves. I also talked about the difficulties which will occur if you don't communicate in a transparent and authentic way with students. I talk often about transitional friction, that students may not always understand what we're doing when we're moving towards UDL, and that can backfire and can actually be really counterproductive for a lot of faculty who may feel like, but I've tried and I'm so energetic and enthusiastic, and look, the first feedback I get from students is they don't like it. So it can be truly detrimental. It stops a lot of people in their track if you're not prepared for that and you don't see the need to have that dialogue and that authenticity. So some questions I leave you here with is, stakeholders and advocates yearn for, and there's a typo there, yearn for clean processes, but this is not a clean process. Everything I've described today is as messy as it gets. How comfortable are you with risk-taking and messiness and jumping in and doing all this? A lot of questions I get asked when I did those 4 years of promotion at McGill was, but how did you have the strength and the forethought to jump in and do that? Well, I didn't think, to be honest. That's why I did it. And sometimes you just have to jump into the action and actually do it, right? Because if you start thinking about how difficult and how challenging and how complex it's going to be, you might be, finding it so daunting that you don't do it. But we need change and we need commitment to change. So I really encourage you to dive in and really do this and embrace the messiness. All of us that work in social sciences, that very few of the processes that we do and we investigate and we look at are ever clean and easy, because they are about interactions between humans that do inherently become complex and need subtlety and nuance and all that. And we are all able to bring that to that discourse. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. We just embrace the fact that it's complex and it's a job that's going to take many more decades, and it's going to involve a lot of subtle, nuanced discourses. And that's normal. Section 3 was about acknowledging the remaining hurdles. I'm just going to take a sip of my coffee so I don't lose my voice. Bear with me. We talked about identifying blind spots, and we certainly mentioned that until very recently, for example, UDL wasn't really talking about race much. This is changing now. There's been a lot of anti-racism education connected with UDL. Still very, very little work around Indigenous students, indigenization and decolonization in UDL, so we need to work a lot there. Talked very early on about inviting Indigenous colleagues into that scholarship. And sometimes, I think with Indigenous colleagues, we're very quick to say, oh, I tried, didn't work. Well, keep trying. This isn't going to happen overnight. And it's only because we persist and we keep sending these invitations and making that space hospitable to our Indigenous colleagues that eventually they will feel really welcome in coming into that space and working with us on the potential for UDL in the inclusion of Indigenous students. We talked about mental health, and we have a colleague here who's starting a scholarship on mental health, the importance of UDL on mental health. There are other blind spots, and we have to keep challenging ourselves that really there are no easy solutions here either. And if we're too quick to say yes, we've done it all, we limit the kind of work we can do with UDL. I think it's been a running theme as well, accepting the challenging, accepting that after UDL always is something else. There's other questions that further frontiers that we have to push UDL towards, and that's part of the potential of this model. It's not prescriptive, it's not limited, it's not finite. On the contrary, it's work that we can carry on and use for the rest of our career-wise or sort of lifelong sort of development with teaching. Acknowledge campus power dynamics. I think we've talked amply today about how complex this makes the work that we do around UDL. I've talked about universities in further education campuses, etc., being multi-layered. We have different background, we have different status, we are hierarchical, we're very conscious of status. This impacts the level of communication that we have. These are continuous hurdles that we encounter in the work that we do. So we have to work at deconstructing those power dynamics, because that's the only way we're going to be able to actually move into authentic conversations and real collaborations with all of these folks. It is a continuous work. I think it's the theme of the decade, right? Thinking about power dynamics, and we're certainly not exempt within this environment. So we have to keep thinking about that. And I think today I talked again about the two solitudes, and I said it's a term from Canada, which really should refer to the misunderstanding, cultural misunderstanding between French and English. But I said, you know, I like using that term to talk about the misunderstandings between faculty and the rest of the support staff. And that often we're very quick to think, oh, the other side doesn't understand. The other side also is dealing often with lots of different variables, and that misunderstanding goes both ways, right? Both in the way accessibility folks don't always understand faculty, and faculty don't always understand accessibility folks. It's been the joke in my life that I was accessibility for 4 years, and I was kept being told, you're not faculty, you don't understand. And now I'm faculty, and I get told, you're not accessibility, you don't understand. Is there no winning? So until we break that down and we're able to have, you know, reciprocal, equal dialogues, it's going to be difficult. And the last one, the two last ones. One was to acknowledge the inherent limitations of UDL within a sophisticated audience. We talked about the need to look at inclusive design as being one step further than UDL, never really being satisfied with the fact that just UDL itself is going to be fine, it's going to be, you know, dandy, that's going to be fine. No, we need to accept the need for further ethnographic curiosity into the lived experience of people with disabilities. That sitting in your office and hypothesizing about barriers is one thing, but nothing is going to replace the direct contact that you can have with people who've got that lived experience. And that's interesting, both I think intellectually as you do the UDL work, but also in your life generally, that you should be curious about the lived experience of people with disabilities and want to meet them and be part of that life and understand it more fully from that perspective. So a lot of work to be done there. And the last aspects was looking at the need for not being too quickly satisfied with the fact that UDL and inclusive design and work around accessibility is an end in itself, but understand that really there are other concerns in terms of pedagogy, transformative pedagogy, student-centered pedagogies that we need to continue working on. And right through the talk today, you probably noticed I kept talking about that happy place, where there's a lot of other very important work that gets done, particularly that got done as well during COVID, that got accelerated during COVID around social constructivism. So how do we support our students as they learn to work in teams? Constructivism, how do we make learners autonomous, put them in the driver's seat, work from an inquiry-based position, etc. A lot of work around experiential learning that happened during COVID too, right? Learning firsthand, learning from experience, learning outside the classroom, etc. But all of those things intersect with accessibility and inclusion and UDL, and that's where that happy place is. So never be satisfied with just the fact that, oh, I've ticked the box and I'm doing UDL, I'm doing inclusive design stuff, that's all good. It doesn't stop that inquiry around, again, which is lifelong and career long, about how to make teaching and learning richer and more suited to the needs of our diverse learners. And again, I gave the example here that we saw a lot during COVID of courses that were perfectly accessible in totally UDL design and inclusive, but did not meet the needs of our learners. And we had students saying, well, that's a course I don't like, and it wasn't enough, and I needed a personal dimension, and it wasn't there. So that's a call for action for all of us to think, yes, it's a central concern, it's a pillar. We need to make everything fully inclusive and accessible, but there's other things that are important too that intersect with that as well. So a question I have for you there is that in a neoliberal environment where benchmarks are everything, how can we feel comfortable with a process that never ends? I know it's a big question, but it is, and today people have started talking about evidence-based, and when do we know we've succeeded, and when do we know that we've got the right results, etc. And yet it's a process that I've described as being messy and never finite and continuing lifelong. So you have a contradiction there. And it's again, a contradiction I think you've got to embrace the fact that, yes, we keep learning through our career about teaching and learning. We get better and better at it. But we are pressured under certain benchmarking to show that we also, what we do is evidence-based and that we are creating change, positive change. It's having an impact on retention, etc. And that's something that we have to get comfortable with. So no easy answer there. I'm going to say you have to navigate both these imperatives and be able to feel at ease there. And also, I think while stakeholders yearn for a teaching and learning model that offers all the solutions, it may be utopian. And, you know, it's not because you do an awful lot of research on UDL that you're not going to have to keep reading and do research on other teaching and learning philosophies. And that's part of life. Now, for us, it makes it more complex because if you're not part of teaching and learning or you're not faculty and you're supporting, it means that you need to offer that support within regards to more than one dimension, not just accessibility and inclusion, but other imperatives as well in terms of teaching and learning. So this hopefully takes you a point where you can feel strong and bold going into 2023. I've got some, yeah, so I think it's important that you embrace this challenge, and I've presented a lot of challenges today. Understand it's not a finite process. There's no end to this. I've talked about spectrum all day today, that it's about moving people in the right direction and keeping them moving. It shouldn't be exhaustive either. I'm always a bit wary when I do sessions like this that you have people who come at the end and say, well, I'm going home today and I'm redesigning everything. Pace yourself, right? Be gentle on yourself. If we've learned anything during COVID, is that we have to be gentle on ourselves. We have to learn to pace ourselves, to be sustainable in the way we handle our resources, but ourselves as well. You know, take your time. We had a lot of discussions today. There's no greater motivation than someone having gone through the whole process of UDL about one barrier on their course and a student or students coming back and saying, I really love that. That was really great. You've changed my entire life. Now, the difficulty is that's not going to happen 2 minutes after you've done it. It's a longitudinal process. You know, I receive emails from students I had in K-12 15 years ago who said, remember that day when you did that? That changed my life. And unfortunately, in teaching and learning, that's what happens. That feedback gets to you way, way later. So don't be too discouraged if it doesn't come right away. It will come. And when it comes, it's very powerful and really makes you feel like all that investment, all the work I did into that redesign made a huge difference. But again, because we are in this pressurized neoliberal environments, the students are moving on. They've got other things they have to do. They don't always have the time to come back to you and say, you know, thank you. But they will. They do at another point. They come back, they reflect, they come back to you and say, that made a huge difference. And when you stick to this long enough, you realize that that feedback does come. And that becomes the greatest motivation in trying the next thing and the next modification on your course, your assessment, etc. So be bold and create new alliances. That was another takeaway today. I kept talking about communication and new relationships, etc. So as you leave today, think about all these new collaborations you need to envisage in 2023, and not just envisage, but at one point you need to break the silos and get them happening. And it's not easy because, you know, again, that study I did on instructional designers, faculty, and accessibility, these three groups of folks that we don't know how to talk to each other. We're going to have to learn and move this forward and actually learn to do things differently. Imagine the unimaginable is another note I put down here. UDL is an innovative landscape shifting and transformative process. So it cannot be born out of repetitive bureaucratic processes. We can't hope to do retrofitting and say, suddenly somewhere UDL will happen. You need to take a jump and be bold and make change happen. And that sometimes means disregarding the way we do things in a habitual way and moving forward. Make yourself comfortable with the shifting landscape while never resisting change. That's hard too. And a lot of what I talked about today was supporting others too, as they shift into new mindsets and shift into new ways of doing things. It sounds easy, but to be honest, that's from my experience supervising stuff. That's what I found the hardest, because people do panic as you shift them into new systems and new ways of doing things. And it questions their identity and their professional image of themselves. And so there's a lot of nurturing to be done there in supporting people as they find themselves, they find a new them in the new vision that you're offering them of the future. Come back to the needs approach all the time. And I hope this has been obvious today that no one wants to do something just because you're presenting them with a new model. It's got to respond to a need. So going back always and making sure that you let people affirm what that need is, and you show them the connection between what you're putting forward as UDL and the need that exists is going to be really crucial in the buy-in. You know, I used to walk into meetings and be just like, let me talk to you about UDL. And it really took me 2 years working on a large campus to sit back and think, walk into a room and be silent and say, right, accessibility, and then leave it at that, and people would start talking. We're not happy about this, we're not happy about this, this isn't working. Right, okay, now we have something to talk about. Let's talk about potentials and solutions, and that's where UDL fits in, right? So it really needs to connect with something there that people are feeling as a pressure, and connect UDL back to the social model positioning at all times. I hope I've shown you this today. There's a real risk that if we take UDL, as we take it, we scale it up and we develop it and we showcase it to others, we lose the sense of that the essential act is you are accepting that role and saying, actually, disability is that friction, that lack of fit between the way I design and people's embodiment. I need to return to that. That needs to be my guiding lens on my practice. And people forget, and let me tell you, there's a lot of people who forget out there. You see a lot of UDL folks who are like, they lost the plot, they lost the track. So go back to that. This is the essential part. The rest is superficial, you know, superfluous. It's like it's the important part. It'll avoid you falling into checklist, into falling into list of tools. You know, we haven't had much time to talk about this, but there's no tool that is UDL. During COVID, for example, you know, people said, oh, the flipped classroom is fantastic, right? It's going to solve all our problems. And it did sometimes, but, you know, the flipped classroom is not inherently UDL or not UDL. It depends to what degree you use it and how often you use it and where you use it. So for those of you not familiar, the flipped classroom is a notion you put all the material online somehow and the students immerse themselves in it. And then when you are actually interacting with them, it's problem solving and applying and really, you know, going to that dialogical place. But if you do that all the time, you are removing barriers for some learners and creating barriers for others. So that is not inherently UDL. It depends to what extent. Once in a while, yeah, it's great. It's going to, you know, give some motivation to some learners who otherwise drown in that sort of lecture style. But if you do it all the time, you actually are marginalizing others. You're creating barriers for other learners. So really important that we always see things in terms of that critical lens and looking at social model. We don't just take a tool or a strategy and say, this is UDL in itself. It's not. And then reassure yourself that you're not working yourself out of a job. That came up a couple of times. You know, I did a presentation a few years back, which was, you know, working myself out of a job. You're never working yourself out of a job. You will reinvent your professional identity within this new landscape of UDL. By the time I had finished working at McGill for 4 years, a lot of my case officers were very happy doing different jobs and had reinventing their job, doing something totally different. And that's what's dynamic about the sector we're in. So don't be afraid of that. And I think that's a perpetuated myth that we need to debunk. I think that leaves it at that. I've got a few questions here, but I know Darlene has questions as well. Got about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. Yeah.
Everything else is summarized.
Thank you. Otherwise, I did get a whole bunch from the room, so yeah.
There you go. So thank you, everybody, for once again joining us online and in the room. For those online, you can put your questions in the Q&A panel there, and David will kindly offer to answer them. So, David, do you have one question there?
Yes. We've got a question from Elizabeth online, asking if you have any tips or advice about engaging students with lived experience in the implementation of UDL, or feeding back on what is and isn't working.
Absolutely. I think often in the UDL process, right, you hypothesize about the barriers, you use your UDL principle to redesign, you find a design solution, you implement it, and people often miss the last part. You ask your students if it's working, right? And we are very quick to skip back in a cyclical mode, start the next thing, but don't forget to ask your students if it's working. They will be more than happy to tell you whether it's actually made a difference for them or not. So again, there's that transparency. They won't understand what you're doing unless you actually talk to them about what you're doing. So for me, certainly I do it through, for example, my learning, management system, but I will put videos from the start saying, this is what orientates my practice. This is why I make certain choices within these courses. understand my choices within this wider intention. And then I'll repeat that in the first class, and I'll repeat again midpoint, and I'll say, do you understand the choices I'm making in light of this? And again, you need trust in young people. Even from school onwards, people say, oh, I can't talk to students about the choices I make pedagogically. They won't understand it. Of course they'll understand it. You see elementary students understand fully the choices that you make, and they understand why you make them. Contextualize things for your learner. They will more than understand what you're trying to do. And this is helpful because don't forget that your learner may really thrive in what you're doing, but still has to go back to a course that is traditionally taught the period after. So they've also got to learn that ability to navigate systems that are contradictory and where it's not happening across the board. So it's even more important to support them and have those conversations with them. But at the wider level as well, systemically, we talked today about having workshops and training and really making students part of the whole process, including having them in the whole UDL branding aspects that often they're the ones that create messaging, involve volunteers in that whole piece as well.
Thank
Elizabeth
you.
says, thank you very much. Great points and suggestions.
Yeah.
Sorry, the challenge is, David, I don't think the online actually hears that. We might have to get you to run up here if you I could.
If I read a question, can you repeat the question? I think
Yep.
that's how we can do it.
I can read it from here too. Does anybody in the room have a question? Just being aware that you are being recorded for prosperity, but yeah, feel free to ask any questions, or as Fredric says, he
Well, I've
got a whole heap. So before we go to those, any questions? I just want to give a quick plug, and I'll just before we lose our online audience, ADCET's really working hard to actually make sure we've got lots of resources to support you in your practice. And we actually have content around universal design for learning. And some people today I've talked to didn't realise that we actually have an e-learning resource around universal design for learning. So we will kind of in the email following from this session, we'll provide you a whole heap of links. We're also putting some links into the chat for the online audience. Also, one of the questions that was raised today was around accessible ICT procurement. We have recently, and people who didn't know, we've launched an accessible ICT procurement guide for universities that's really impactful, that we hope universities will embed in their procurement. And that's a yes. Thank you. And we actually met with the TAFE directors a couple of weeks ago, and we look like we'll be implementing one for TAFE as well in the new year. And we've also got a range of new content that we've developed around inclusive teaching and teaching with technology that we've just put on our front page. That's the UTS have actually supported us to develop, and that's really, once again, it talks about everything from Mentimeter and other online tools that we all use that to make sure that they're as accessible as possible. So we're really hoping that what we do is supporting your practice. And I think there was one more thing I did forget about. Oh, our community of practice. Sorry. We also have a community of practice. We've got over 100 members so far across Australia. We're putting the link into the chat now, but we'll also provide everybody here today with a link on how to join the community of practice. The wonderful Jen Cousins facilitates that with some colleagues, and well, actually it's community of practice. We'll all be facilitating it next year, but it's a really powerful way to get together. And our last meeting, we actually talked about the an award system as well, similar to what Fredric spoke today about the Ahead Island program, because I think that's going to be a celebration of what we're all doing. So I have taken on the floor, but I'll let you do some questions.
Super. Thanks. So I had a question there, with a couple of questions that are connected about low-hanging fruit. What would have the most impact on students with disabilities in terms of UDL implementation? And actually, to be honest, a lot of very simple UDL strategies have an immediate impact, certainly on the level of demands that are made with student services, and also from the experiences I've had with my own courses. So already, simple things like ensuring that all your material is digitally available. It seems ridiculous, but when I was at McGill, I had a full-time person just digitalizing material. Can you imagine in 2022 that people still defaulting to paper and paper copies and PDFs that are not readable and things like this. So simple, and that's really the low-hanging fruit, definitely. Deadlines and working around UDL stretches around deadlines. So we talked today about, for example, an example I had from practice of these 6 days or 7 days, whatever, of grace periods, that you keep the accountability part, but learners are able to navigate this without you having to have intrusive questions or asking why, and it applies to everyone and everyone finds what they need out of that. That's very easy as well. So mostly around, again, and that connects with what Jacqueline talked about, mental health, with the deadlines is mental health. So you sort a lot of that. With the digitalization of material, again, a lot gets solved. And I would say with learning management systems as well, whether you're Canvas or Moodle, etc., there's different levels of accessing the level of complexity. So giving people choice, and not just 5 pieces to read, but one being complex, one being easier, one being really short, etc. So people have different level of scaffolding into your outcomes. I think those 3 methods already, you're getting rid of a lot of issues of accessibility there, just with those three simple methods. So lots of low-hanging fruits. I had a really interesting question. You remember when we looked at, okay, we had a question on, remember when I showed you the illustration from my article with a stakeholder in the middle and thinking about the ecology of that stakeholder's relationship with the role of campus? Someone came and said, well, should we rethink that? And should we have a kind of hive formation? Does it have to be centralized around someone? I think that's really important. And actually, if you look at some of the models that are interestingly occurring now, Trinity College Dublin has started Trinity Inclusive. And I was part of this as part of a fellowship. And the principle was to have ambassadors. And so they really thought about it strategically. They actually onboarded a whole bunch of faculty ambassadors. Didn't call it UDL, they call it inclusive, but a lot of what they do is UDL. And then they had a commitment of taking part in professional development. I met with them 3 times during that professional development, before, in the middle, and after. And then off they went to the departments and they become the ambassador of all that work that's happening around the campus. That's a high formation, right? You're starting to think about matrix and people doing the work in a spread way across your campus. Lots of creativity there, definitely, and I think we can definitely break out of that model that has one unit or one department or one body in the middle, and that might be something in terms of sustainable development that works better. I had a question about convincing senior administration. I would take you back to that slide where I had the 6 needs today, and I think definitely the money part works, right? So when you look at sustainability and the growing demographics, it's extremely costly to do what we do at the moment, and having different ways of doing it is definitely something that's going to talk to your senior administration. Now, some of you in the room might say, but that's really cynical, and we shouldn't be thinking about accessibility services just being costly. Again, I hope you've seen today, you've got to be practical and pragmatic, and you need a full deck of cards when you walk into a room and you want to work a room. I don't necessarily agree with the financial argument, but it is convincing for some of the people you're going to talk to. And I think, this whole notion of neoliberalism, I wrote an article at one point saying, we can fight it, we can argue against it, we can say that it's really despicable. Or we can say, actually, there's a bit of room for social justice work within the neoliberal model, because you know what? There's not one campus out there that's not highly conscious of the fact that if they don't do social justice work, they're going to lose their market and they're going to lose their market share. So you could play their own game and say, right, but this has become a neoliberal stake. If you want to stay relevant and stay sustainable financially, you actually need to incorporate that. Now, I remember when I left McGill, it finally got embedded into the mission statement. And I said, wow, that's visionary. And I remember a guy who was behind the stage said, well, they didn't have a choice. They had a market consultant that told them if they don't put it in the vision statement, they're going to start losing their market share in Canada. But that's where we are. So take advantage of it, right? I think we can flip this back and say, right, but you want to work from a neoliberal environment, we can play the social justice card there, and you have to listen to us, because at the moment, I don't know how long it's going to last, but at the moment it definitely has an impact on resources and on revenue, etc. So don't be afraid to use arguments you don't agree with, because it's the ones that might convince people that have a very different agenda than you have. Now, one of the questions was research-based evidence, and I think this came up lots of times today. I don't think that a commitment to social justice or to equity or inclusion needs to have an evidence base before we start doing it. And as I said, in K-12, we didn't wait for the evidence before we started doing inclusion, and thank God, because we'd still be back in the 60s. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be collecting evidence as we go forward, but I think we've got to be very careful with this notion, say, well, I don't want to start this if I don't have evidence. And there's a lot of other things anyway that we do in higher ed that we have no evidence for, but we still do it. So at least that one has got values, commitments to the right thing, and then we can collect the evidence as we go forward. Now, I think we've got to acknowledge that from a methodological perspective and an ethical perspective, it's very hard to collect data on UDL initiatives anyway. Often people will start talking about running 2 courses or 2 halves of courses, one UDL, one not UDL. Well, no, you can't do that. You're never going to get ethics clearance on that. You can't give access to inclusive measures to half your class and not the other half. And if you were to run the same course twice, okay, that would already be problematic. I don't want to be inclusive this time around just to get my data. Again, will you get ethics? But even if you did, there's so many other variables that you are not controlling, and you also are quantifying that, is it just UDL? Is it other things? Is it your temperament that semester as you give the course? There's a lot of other things that you also inherently measuring. So we got to be careful. There is a lot of avenues, I think, for a lot of great qualitative work. And I think in social sciences, we shouldn't be afraid of qualitative work. And a lot of the rich work that's starting to appear around UDL is actually qualitative. Simple things like working with student groups who are giving you feedback. Think about this. Students are going through a trajectory. They themselves highlight the practices and the courses that really worked for them and what was aligned with their needs. There's a lot of great work around phenomenology, ethnography with students where you could work from a campus and actually collect the data in that sense. Every government wants a link between retention and graduation and UDL. Well, good luck, because, it's that sort of quantitative data on that kind of scale. How are you, again, going to isolate, a variable and not the others? But I think there's lots of ways that we can meet the thirst that we have for data and do a lot of really rich qualitative work. There's a lot of people doing really great phenomenological work around their course redevelopments, etc. And that's really, really important too, right? There's a lot of reflection that faculty are doing as they're going through this process about that change of practice, the new practices they put in place, etc. And we shouldn't be afraid of qualitative work just because it's qualitative. After all, we are in the field of social sciences, and we have to embrace that as well. So lots of opportunities, but let's not stall things just because we don't have that perfect report that tells us that UDL is evidence-based and let's move forward. Someone had a question about time frame. For the time frame, I would really take it back to that notion of ecological mapping that you do before you begin. I don't think that the time frame is going to be the same on every campus. I've seen small campuses that are fairly recent in terms of historical development that have moved very, very fast, and it's normal. They have different types of collaboration between stakeholders, and the organization is much more nimble and fast moving. They move a lot faster than some of the giant universities, giant campuses, and some of the historical ones as well. Even in the States, they're talking about campuses now of like 120,000 students. Like, imagine, talking 10,000 faculty. How are you going to move that fast, right? No, it's going to take you years. But again, I think it really depends on your goals, depend on that mapping and the environment that you're working with. I don't know if David has more questions to alternate a little bit.
Yes, thanks, Fredric. There's probably got time for one more online question. So we did have quite a good discussion in the room about this question, which is, while there may be many stakeholders involved in UDL, who is or should be responsible for it?
So over the many stakeholders, who should be responsible for it? So I think that's a big question today. And again, I would take you back to that notion of ecological analysis. I don't think, and I've reiterated this several times today, that there's a one size fits all. In UDL within the classroom, there's not one size fits all, but in terms of implementation, there isn't one size fits all. I think it really depends on the evaluation that you do about the landscape that you're working with. Again, I think that even for me, I've seen with the question I received today that this notion of always thinking about who's in the center of that equation and who's moving the drive is maybe limiting, and maybe we should be thinking about hive and matrix formation and clusters and things that are much more creative and maybe much more adapted to 21st century transformational leadership and how do we get people moving. There's definitely this thing that sometimes on campuses are so big that this notion of ambassadors and a matrix formation and spiderweb might work much better, because then people have a lot more autonomy within each department to move things at their own rhythm, for their own, with their own resources that they have. So I think that that's something that needs to be, again, dependent on the bigger analysis that you do of format. I've got one last one there, so okay. Quick. People saying, someone asked suggestions for keeping, for training courses for academics to align material with UDL. The answer here, we touched on it a little bit, but I would say, because of all these hierarchical dichotomies and the difficulties that we have in hearing people who are not faculty tell us how to teach, it's really painful, let me tell you. If you ever have to do observation for tenure, I'll tell you, it's not the nicest thing when you think you're doing things great and someone walks in and said, you're not doing that, you're not doing that, you're not doing that. So it's really painful, and we've got to accept that faculty find that really tough. So the best way, and I've learned that at McGill, was really this notion of faculty to faculty. So again, and that involves students, right? That's one of the things I described today, having students report back which courses and which specific practices they found particularly useful and were aligned with UDL, and then contacting those faculty. Now you hit two birds with a stone there, because faculty are really happy when you tell them, I've got student feedback that they really love this. And then you say, would you like to model this for other faculty? Very short, right? We learn 2-minute videos. You've got to understand people have very short attention span these days, and they don't have much time for professional development. So I think the shorter, the better. And you really target it on one little thing. You're doing this in an excellent way. Can you showcase it to others? It's really good for them and their tenure track dossier and all that. And I think they feel really good that it's again feedback that they've tried this, it worked. Students are really noticing. Now other faculty members are going to notice as well. And it's a kind of nice, subtle way, I think, that that UDL spreads. Don't forget that people sometimes are really afraid to be noticed. I've already knocked on the doors of faculty and said, do you like to showcase this? And they've told me, no, I do all this and it's really inconspicuous and no one gives me any shit. So don't, I don't want anyone to notice. So, don't forget that this is what faculty are working with, right? So little subtle nuanced things that they're not going to get. Open Pandora's box and start a whole departmental question about academic integrity. They'll be quite happy to showcase you a little bit, and then to get that feedback and then to be part of the discourse and the promotion. But you've got to understand, again, the complexity of the lives that they have and the environments that they navigate as well. That's good? Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone online and in the room.
Yeah, thank you, everybody online, and also big thanks to Lee, our captioner. I did try to get him to slow down. I think she was doing an amazing job, so take a rest, Lee.
Yeah,
so we're going to say goodbye to our online audience. The session will be on ADCET. You can rewatch it, and all the PowerPoint from today is up there, as well as the session we had today. The PowerPoint is also there. So the 2 PowerPoints are up on ADCET now if people want to go to that. So we'll close off here and then we will say goodbye in the room. So thank you, everybody. It was great to have you all join us. Take care.